Welcome to Slash Forward. In this video, we're going to recap our second anthology, the ultimate anthology, the 1982 George Romero directed Creepshow, set within a framework of bringing to life a series of stories ripped straight from the pages of a pulpy horror comic book. We'll wait patiently through a variety of suspenseful, terror-filled segments to see if young Billy ever gets his final revenge. If you've seen this one before, let me know which segment left the most lasting impression on you. There'll probably be some variety there, but I'm gonna guess for most people, it's the crate. And if you like anthologies, check out my recap of Trick or Treat, the ultimate modern-day horror anthology. Let's get to it. We open on a papa giving his son the business over his dirty practice of consuming comic books.
I got some garbage I want to throw away.
That's your son. With that filthy business now tended to, Dad relaxes with the gin and tonic as a storm rolls in, and young Billy calls in a favor from the mistress of the dart. We then take a comic transition to Father's Day, where a well-to-do gaggle of sluts delicately sip, smoke, and cram down scones like a pack of hogs. They're awaiting the arrival of crusty old Aunt Bedelia. As the story goes, she lost her beloved husband in a supposed hunting accident, which led her to smash her father's face in under the presumption that he had actually orchestrated the death. Or so it goes in the family rumor mill. She returns to the scene of the crime every Father's Day to pour out one for Daddy and relive the delicious high of taking a life in cold blood. They both humor her and keep their traps shut because the old man's passing enriched them all so greatly. In a flashback, we see the rumors were true, but her murderous rage was actually incited by Father's inability to wait patiently for his traditional Father's Day cake. And something he may have appreciated more deeply had he realized that in most households, there's actually no such thing. Nonetheless, she did him in and does find some measure of catharsis in working some things out graveside. But she soon comes to learn that she really should have let him at least eat the cake first, so as to tie off any unfinished business. Back in the house, Cass and Hank are rocking out, peacocking like crazy, and oozing their raw sensuality all over the dance floor. They're having a hard time waiting until Bedelia arrives to pop their corks. So a bored Hank heads out to show us just how cool he is, and also see if he can get the old girl into the house so they can eat. He ventures out among the misty headstones and thistlewood, slowly making his way until he finds some free graveyard whiskey, but he loses his footing, and under threat of a squishin', he tries holding absolutely still, a strategy destined to fail. Still, at least he gets to see some cool shit before hopping off the planet. Back in the house, they sit in idle boredom as Cass makes love to herself. Sylvia decides to go see if she can find Hank in case he found Bedelia, but she's almost immediately sidetracked by the strange disappearance of Mrs. Danvers, and then by her sudden reappearance, which acts as a demonstration of how bad Poppy wants that cake. The night grows stale as the siblings, Cass and Richard, continue to wait for someone to serve them dinner. Cass pleads for help in finding Hank, so they venture off together and are finally served, but in a way that makes us wonder what the big deal was, if he knew how to make his own cake this whole time. We then swoop in as old George Romero witnesses a meteor crash down, prompting Stephen King to do an acting. His space rock is mostly intact and putting off a beautiful light, but is also hot as hell. Of course, he immediately turns to dreams of fame and riches.
$200.
Making him impatient to get that rock to the local science place. He douses that sumbitch, but he's not too bright and cracks her open when he goes too fast. With his hopes now dashed, he could take consolation in the fact that it's filled with a strange goo, but instead he dumps the precious fluid and absconds with only the outer shell. As usual, he spends his evening watching pictures, drinking, and sucking on his fingers. Meanwhile, his plot becomes positively verdant. This extends to his greasy little digits. But as he understands the field of medicine, doctors are thirsty for the chance to cut off body parts, so he thinks better of calling that old quack. Instead, he sits around and lets this unknown fountain of life propagate all over him. This isn't a better choice, and really just means more amputations in the future. Seemingly realizing that it's too late for him to leave, he makes an extra-large screwdriver to see if a little blackout will cure what ails him. He wakes up to discover that it has not, so despite the fact that it's not Sunday, he goes for a bath. The ghostly apparition of dead Daddy Vero warns him not to get wet, but Jordy figures he's a goner anyway, so he gives it a go in the hope that the warm water will provide some temporary relief. It does, but when he wakes up in the morning, he is primarily vegetable now, and this new state of affairs prompts him to toss his own salad. In the next segment, we find Harry Wentworth as he's being awoken from a nap by Richard Vickers, the powerful man whose wife Harry has been Richarding. Harry attempts to barter favor for favor, pointing out that now he knows where Becky stands, and it's not like Richard actually cares for her anyway. But love or not, he found his success in life by greedily hoarding what's his. And wives are property to do with as a man pleases, says he. When he catches a familiar glint in Harry's eyes, he brings him back to heel with a recording that reveals Becky to be immiserated in some sort of spousal torture situation. Once it's clear that he holds all the cards, Richard explains that if he ever wants to see Becky again, he'll have to remain obedient as they take a little trip. When they arrive at the dunes of Comfort Point, he pops it into 4 low and drives them back to a trailhead. Vickers then playfully leads him along to reveal his sweet new sandcastle. Initial impression is poor, and when they get closer, it does indeed appear to just be a soggy hole, within which Harry is to insert the entirety of his body. He's somewhat resistant to this, but also doesn't want to mess his face up, so he does what he's told. The plan is to incapacitate him prior to bringing out Becky. Once everything's nice and tidy, Harry finds that the undercurrent keeps the sand below him unstable, preventing him from finding any leverage. All this torture and psychological misery really keeps Dick young at heart, so he toys around with him a bit just to show him who's boss. Later on, right as Harry is at the highest risk of getting snipped, Richard rolls back up with some cables and AV equipment. As a man of honor, he fulfills his promise of letting Harry see Becky. On high-fidelity video buried further down the shore, the tide's already coming in for her, and he's forced to watch helplessly as she struggles to continue existing, an apt metaphor for life. Richard gives him another jolly good taunting before heading back for a light dinner. Once he's gone, Harry tries to figure a way out, but you can't stop the tides. Back at Comfort Station, Richard gets positively titillated about having a little drink and watching the action unfold on his CCTV. Harry gives him a good show, going through a variety of emotions before the reality finally sets in.
Oh my god.
And he vows to get his revenge before going Super Saiyan below the surface of the water. Afterward, Richard goes to retrieve his various items, because it's all our obligation to keep the beaches and ocean clean, and he's left to assume that the tide pulled the body out to sea. Later on, as he looks for the perfect videotape to cap off his evening, he thinks he hears the whisper of his name floating on the salty ocean breeze. When he finds nothing, he decides to reward his day of hard work with a hot shower. Incidentally, the ocean mists begin to roll onto the property and into the house, as the fish become the first to bear witness to their moist, waterlogged visitors. Hearing a strange, wet slapping noise outside the door, he enrobes and arms himself. Wary of the possibility that Harry escaped, he shouts a series of flaccid threats and tells them to get lost, even though he really should make sure they're dead. Of course, opening the door reveals that he did achieve his goal, but then this renders his bullets completely useless, which is very unsatisfying for the enterprising murder enthusiast. They capture him and then put him to the test to see how long he can hold his breath, and he claims he can do so for a pretty long time. But we're not sticking around for that because we have to catch up with Mike, who, unwilling to lose his lucky nickel, finds an intriguing crate below the stairs. After that, we meet henpecked Henry, a professor, and his uncouth wife, Wilma.
Oh, just call me Billy, everyone does.
Why? She bull rushes her way through social situations, a tremendous faux pas in their social group of old money academics, completely incapable of reading social cues. She puts the offense on repeat. The awkwardness of cordially navigating around this has put a damper on Henry's relationship with his department head, Dexter Stanley, a career-limiting factor. Dexter's happy to be summoned to a phone call, which happens to be from Mike. You see, the crate he found is dated to 1834. And he figured the man in charge should be in charge of overseeing its handling. So he steps out while Henry has one of his daytime delusions centered around murdering his wife, and is always sad when he snaps back to the real world where he's a real limp dick. When Stanley gets to the facility, they remove the grate while bristling with curiosity. Moving in close, they find the thing to reek worse than Bigfoot's ballsack, but they waste no time wrestling it onto their box opening table, noting that it feels like the load is shifting. Meanwhile, Billy does a quick perm check before heading out, and along the way gives Henry enough unnecessary instructions to evoke another exorcidal fantasy. In the lab, once they get the lid cracked, they start pulling out the nails that are securing the top. They're nearly finished with that when Mike thinks he spies a shiny trinket and pushes through the stench to grab at something. But something grabs back. Stanley's left to watch in horror as the beast within claims his treat whilst leaving behind a bloody mess. Dexter runs out and into Charlie and incoherently screams into his face. Concerned that he may come across as a tweaker, Charlie goes to seek confirmation of the story before calling for help. He does find a bloody surprise, but there is no crate. This tips the scales back towards Stanley being a psychopath, except the blood trails belie this. They surmise that the monster returned to its safe cozy spot beneath the stairs. Charlie gets the flashlight and a pipe wrench, and since he fancies himself a hero,
I want that shoe.
Risks his life to retrieve Mike's Timbo, but the whole area is now so thick with musk that he doesn't realize the monster is no longer in the box until it's too late. Stanley does what he can to help, but he can't get too close, resulting in Charlie getting absolutely wrecked. The next thing we know, Stanley's bursting into his chess date with Henry, again babbling like a maniac, so Hank tries to bring him down a bit with some calm juice and gives him some space to fill in the deets. At the end of his story, he ponders how to rid themselves of the cursed crate, suggesting it may look good at the bottom of the quarry. But in his confusion, he fails to notice that Henry is now overcome with other types of thoughts. He laces Dexter's next drink with something special and leaves a note for Billy. He drives straight to campus to confirm the bloody scene. He then risks everything to make sure a good mag light doesn't go to waste before he sets to cleaning the area, getting everything so spick and span you could eat off it if you enjoy taking your meals on the floor. Meanwhile, Wilma arrives home and finds his letter, which is positively swelling with juicy drama. It claims Stanley got into a pickle with a young student who he attacked. Playing to Billy's narcissism, he claims the girl is scared and hidden away, and that only someone as naturally talented as her could properly adjudicate the situation and coax the young girl out. She arrives still sucking on her white Russian and giddy with anticipation. He lures her in and convinces her to take a little peek below the stairs. Then he bum rushes her, making a tremendous racket and calling upon nature's wrath. But when nothing happens, he begins to lose faith in the efficacy of his plan. Thankfully, when he needs it the most, the wish monster makes his appearance, pauses for effect, and then feasts on Billy. Afterward, Henry stealthily locks his boy up tight and tidy, then loads up the crate and dumps that helpful bitch to the bottom of the quarry. He reveals the details of what went down to Stanley, and the two men make a pact of friendship, vowing to maintain a mutual silence. The final story takes us to a man dedicated to the maintenance of his personal environment. He loathes germs and bugs and disposes of everything that touches anything. He gets a call from his chief executive, George, who can barely get a word in about stock fluctuations without Upson interrupting to complain about his bug problem. Because once they get a foot in, it's very hard to get them out. George notifies him that Old Man Kastenmeyer, the owner of the company they just took over, has killed himself. A possible hit to the stock price, but also saving them the time and effort to eject him from the board. Later that evening, Upson gets a call from the widow Kastenmeyer and takes absolute pleasure in listening to her account of her husband's death, welcoming her curses. Then, Upson's building manager finally calls him back to discuss the roaches, and Upson threatens to fire him if he doesn't take action on the matter of the bugs. Despite his vigilance,
They creep up on you.
he discovers that they've even infiltrated his rolled oats. Mr. White, the maintenance man, arrives and lets him know via an eye-to-teeth conversation that he's found a 24-hour exterminator he intends to call. And it's not a single moment too soon, as the little buggers begin crawling out of every available crack and crevice. This coincides with a rolling brownout on its way toward the building. So when Upson calls the police for immediate action regarding his roach problem, they're actually too busy to help with that due to all the issues created by the power outages. This also delays the exterminator, as White is now stuck in the elevator until the power comes back on. He's left to deal with this in his own way, but he finds himself ill-equipped for an infestation of this magnitude. As a last resort, he retreats to his hermetically sealed panic room, which he's horrified to discover is also riddled with bugs. He recoils in horror, and when the lights come back on again, we see that his bug problem was all in his mind, as well as all of his other organs. Bookending this series of stories, we check back in at Billy's neighborhood, where the garbage men come to get the trash and marvel at all the cool trinkets you can send away for. Except for the voodoo doll in this case. That one is already spoken for. Not coincidentally, at the breakfast table, Stan begins to notice an escalating stiffness in the back of his neck. which then converts to an acute pinching of his throat. He suffers this as Billy, we see, gets off on tormenting his daddy. So putting a cap on things, I'm going to try to remember the details story by story, but there's a lot of different things happening here. I had to skip over quite a bit in the Father's Day story because it started with just a huge exposition dump that was both convoluted and conjecture, meaning that some of the details provided were inaccurate. Cass, Richard, Sylvia, and Bedelia are related by blood. Hank is Cass's husband. The rumors were that Sylvia and Bedelia's father had Bedelia's husband killed simply because he didn't respect him, and that this resulted in Bedelia killing their father. Bedelia's flashback shows that she went crazy when Daddy wouldn't stop badgering her about getting his cake. Did her husband's death exacerbate this? Possibly, but it's also pretty clear from the events that transpired that the cake issue was definitely the primary factor. She smashed his head, then covered it up by making it look like he suffered a fall. Regardless of the details, her involvement in the patriarch's death is tolerated because it sped up the distribution of their inheritance. In The Crate, it was fairly well established that Billy's behavior was inhibiting Henry's career. Despite being friends, at least professionally, Stanley was having a hard time overlooking her boorish behavior. They had a weekly chess game scheduled that Dexter was starting to lean away from because life is too short to spend much of it in Billy's company. In the end, part of their agreement was that they would have chess games 2 times a week now and be best friends. Henry was feeling much more confident and leveraged the fact that Stanley fell apart, but he rolled up his sleeves and basically did everything to his advantage. Stanley was scared that the beast might get out or someone might find out, but Henry was fairly confident he took care of business. Incidentally, the final scene does show it breaking out of the crate. 2 other small details: Charlie was attempting to retrieve Mike's shoe so he could measure the bite marks to try to determine what kind of animal it was. It remains unclear why so many characters risk their hands in the pursuit of the flashlight. Also, Henry had locked Stanley in his office before he left to minimize the risk of him being found. The first thing that becomes apparent when taking this all in is that there are definitely levels to this. While the movie overall left a good impression, some of the segments were clearly weaker than the others. This may ultimately come down to personal preference, however. Father's Day had a great conclusion, but prior to that, it was basically an info dump and then each character walking out and disappearing in procession. The 2 segments that most effectively told a complete story that built up and provided satisfying payoff were Something to Tide You Over and The Crate. Speaking of cohesion, while the comic book setup is a good way to tell a series of otherwise unrelated stories, it would have been nice to have had some of that interspersed throughout to tell its own story and logically lead to the conclusion. I mean, I guess it was pretty obvious that Stan was a full-time dickhead, so Billy likely ordered his voodoo doll before having his comics thrown out. But still, that was just sort of revealed at the end despite a completely different promise being made at the beginning. And then it left the ending open. We never find out if Stan died or just had a sore throat. Despite any of the weaknesses, the segments at least finished on strong imagery. While there wasn't much lead up in Father's Day, his cake was pretty cool. I wondered about ending the film on "They're Creeping Up on You" because it's not one of the stronger segments, but the bug imagery definitely leaves a lasting impression. This was also a seemingly rare early 80s horror movie that was actually appreciated in its time. It got a positive critical reception and started a string of anthology films through the 80s and 90s. Despite the effort, none of the subsequent films, even those that were outside of this series, were as commercially successful as Creepshow, which gave Romero his only #1 box office opening. I can't remember which one I liked more between this one and the sequel, but this film definitely has a nearly perfect balance between its elements of horror, comedy, suspense, and so on. If you like 80s horror, this is essential viewing. Just Stevie King and Romero having a goddamn good time, you know? This and the sequel were legendary back in the day, possibly due to the muted violence and comic book aesthetics. I remember kids talking about crazy individual scenes from these films like they were urban legends. This likely originated from the lucky kids who had HBO or Cinemax and were allowed to watch these movies since they didn't seem that bad. But despite the gore being obscured by the vibrant colors and lighting, these films still go pretty hard. Legendary effects man Tom Savini worked on this, and there was some good stuff, especially in The Crate. Also, as I pointed out before, it's basically the granddaddy of anthology films, despite having some weak segments. It should be watched as a baseline against which you compare other anthology films. If you're more of a hardcore viewer or a fan of films from the aughts onward, this one may be a bit cheesy. Also, while this one paved the way for tons of media that came after, the twists and turns of the stories don't quite hold the same shock or surprise as later iterations, like the first few seasons of the TV series. But for me, it's still always fun to see where things originated. Before we go, I'd like to give huge thanks to my donors memorialized in the Hall of Headshots. I have a website set up where you can support the channel through donations or merch. Any donation unlocks a growing collection of uncensored movie recaps. And if you enjoyed the video, I would love for you to become part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.